What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
You know that gut-wrenching moment when the one day meant to celebrate your child's milestone slips away into utter silence, leaving behind an emptiness that echoes louder than any party noise ever could. Especially when the very people who should have been there crowding around with gifts and well wishes instead vanish like ghosts from a bad dream, only to resurface days later with their hands outstretched demanding money for someone else's spotlight while pretending the neglect never happened. And that's precisely the kind of raw betrayal that shattered the fragile peace I'd been clinging to in my everyday life as a single mom scraping by in the heartland, turning what should have been a simple family oversight into the catalyst for a chain of events that would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty and love, leaving me, and hopefully you, questioning just how much a person can take before they start rewriting the rules of their own story in ways that hit back harder than anyone expects. I can still picture the living room in our modest ranch-style house on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, where the clock on the mantel had ticked relentlessly past 8 o'clock on the evening of Alex's 18th birthday. Each deliberate second amplifying the void where the chaos of arriving guests, the rustle of colorful wrapping paper being torn open, and the infectious laughter of cousins chasing each other around should have filled every corner. But instead there was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen and me perched on the edge of our threadbare couch, my hands folded in my lap as I gazed at the solitary chocolate cake cooling on the coffee table. Its surface imperfectly frosted from a boxed mix, because between my 12-hour shifts as a registered nurse at the local community hospital and juggling the endless cycle of bills that seemed to multiply like rabbits after my divorce, who had the energy or the budget for elaborate homemade confections that would likely go uneaten anyway? It hadn't always felt this unbalanced in our family dynamics, not during the earlier years when Mark and I were still navigating the turbulent waters of marriage with its constant undercurrents of financial disagreements and the exhausting division of labor over who would handle school pickups or weekend soccer practices. But ever since the papers were signed 3 years ago and he moved into that cramped apartment across town with his sales job that kept him perpetually on the road, a subtle but insidious shift had occurred, elevating our younger son Ben, born just 10 months after Alex, to this unassailable status of the favored one, the straight-A student and star athlete whose every achievement was broadcast like a victory parade, while Alex, with his introspective nature and passion for sketching intricate superhero worlds in the margins of his notebooks rather than dominating the sports field, gradually receded into the shadows as if his quiet talents were somehow less worthy of celebration or support. In a misguided attempt to bridge the growing divide and create some semblance of normalcy for Alex's big milestone, I'd sent out invitations weeks in advance through our family group text, meticulously detailing the casual backyard barbecue I'd planned, complete with hamburgers on the grill and the specific drawing tablet Alex had been hinting at for months as his dream gift. Reaching out not just to my sister Lisa, who lived only 20 minutes away in Springfield, but also to Mark's mother, Grandma Ruth, whose retirement had supposedly freed up her schedule for such family gatherings, yet the replies that came back were as evasive and half-hearted as a politician dodging a tough question. With Lisa citing an unavoidable work deadline that conveniently coincided with the date and Ruth offering a vague excuse about her sciatica acting up again after years of the same complaint surfacing whenever inconvenience loomed. While Mark, true to his pattern of minimal effort, responded with nothing more substantial than a single thumbs-up emoji that landed in my inbox like a dismissive pat on the head, even though he'd verbally committed during one of our co-parenting calls to make the drive back from his route in Cincinnati no matter what. So the evening unfolded in this painfully subdued manner, with Alex retreating to his bedroom upstairs shortly after I called him down for the makeshift ritual, his shoulders hunched under the weight of oversized headphones that served as his barrier against disappointment, and me left to light the lone candle on that lopsided cake before launching into a solitary rendition of the birthday song, whose notes bounced awkwardly off the paneled walls and faded into the stillness without any harmonious echoes to buoy them. And when Alex finally emerged to blow out the flame without voicing a single wish aloud, his expression carrying that resigned flicker I'd seen too often, Since he was about 12 and Mark's absences evolved from occasional to chronic, it struck me with a clarity that bordered on physical pain how profoundly this neglect was etching itself into his sense of self-worth, transforming what should have been a rite of passage into just another tally mark in the ledger of overlooked moments. The following morning, as I navigated the familiar route to drop him off at his community college classes where he was pursuing graphic design on a scholarship I'd helped secure through relentless applications and extra shifts that left me bone-tired, he mustered a half-hearted smile from the passenger seat and insisted that birthdays were overhyped anyway in the grand scheme of adulting, but the subtle shadow in his eyes betrayed the lie, reminiscent of the persistent morning fog that clings to the banks of the nearby Miami River no matter how brightly the sun eventually burns through, and it was in that instant during the drive that the initial stirrings of resentment began to coalesce within me, not as a sudden eruption but as a steady, insistent pressure building in my chest like steam in a kettle left too long on the stove, prompting me to reflect on why I'd invested so many years in this role of perpetual accommodator, always smoothing over the rough edges of family expectations and financial strains without ever demanding reciprocity from those who treated our sacrifices as invisible. By the time I pulled into the hospital parking lot and clocked in for another round of charting patient vitals and administering medications under the fluorescent lights that never seemed quite bright enough, my mind was replaying the barren birthday scene on an endless loop, interspersed with wry, self-deprecating humor about how Lisa had once orchestrated an extravagant 10th birthday for Ben featuring a rented bounce house and trays of catered pizza that probably exceeded the cost of my monthly car insurance payment, a stark contrast that highlighted the lopsided priorities without me needing to say a word aloud, and as the afternoon wore on amid the beeps of monitors and the hurried footsteps of colleagues, I'd resolved on this small but symbolic act of resistance by deliberately ignoring the latest group chat invitation for the planning committee of Ben's impending high school graduation festivities, figuring that if my family couldn't muster the effort to honor one son's coming of age, there was no reason for me to expend mine facilitating the glorification of the other. The subsequent days melted into the monotonous rhythm of household chores and mounting utility statements, with Alex immersing himself deeper into his coursework and sketches that captured dystopian landscapes straight out of the science fiction novels we both enjoyed, while I avoided the bathroom mirror that mercilessly reflected the deepening lines of fatigue around my eyes from sleepless nights spent worrying about his future, until precisely 3 days after that hollow celebration, as Alex and I sat down to a simple dinner of reheated lasagna from the night before with its cheese stretching in gooey strings that offered a momentary comfort, my phone vibrated insistently on the table, drawing my attention to a message from Mark that illuminated the screen with its audacious demand for $2,200 to cover the escalating expenses of Ben's graduation party, phrased as if it were an unquestionable obligation on my part to fund their vision of extravagance while conveniently erasing the recent sting of Alex's solitude from the narrative entirely. That message from Mark materialized on my phone screen during what was supposed to be a peaceful dinner hour, its words leaping out with the kind of presumptuous ease he'd honed over 2 decades of our rocky partnership, outlining in blunt detail how the costs for Ben's high school graduation extravaganza were spiraling out of control with venue deposits and catering estimates that demanded immediate attention, positioning it all as my inherent responsibility to contribute equally since I was still the mother in this fractured equation and Ben was on the cusp of that prestigious state university acceptance with its full scholarship that somehow obligated me to underwrite the fanfare leading up to it, though he conveniently sidestepped any acknowledgement of the recent birthday fiasco that had left Alex adrift in solitude just 3 days prior, as if the timeline of our family's selective affections could be erased with a few taps on his keyboard from whatever roadside diner he was nursing a coffee in during his endless sales circuit. I paused with my fork midway to my mouth, the steam from the reheated lasagna curling upward like a question mark in the air between Alex and me at our scarred oak table, where he'd been methodically twirling pasta around his utensil in that distracted way he had when lost in thoughts of his latest graphic design project, and in that suspended moment, the accumulated weight of past dismissals pressed down harder than ever, recalling the countless instances where I'd fronted cash for Ben's club fees or tournament travel without a murmur, while Alex's art supplies languished on wish lists gathering digital dust, a pattern that had solidified post-divorce when Mark's charm offensive always seemed to rally the relatives around our younger son's pursuits, leaving me to quietly absorb the inequities like a sponge in a household budget already stretched thinner than the cheese on our plates, rather than defaulting to the habitual compliance that had kept the fragile truces intact over the years. A spark ignited within me, fueled by the fresh sting of Alex's overlooked milestone, transforming that inner simmer into a deliberate plan of retaliation that felt both liberating and laced with the wry amusement of finally flipping the script on their entitlement. So I pulled up my banking application right there at the table under the warm glow of the pendant light, navigating to the transfer option with fingers that moved with uncharacteristic steadiness before inputting precisely $1 into the designated account he'd provided in his message, attaching a concise note that simply read "best wishes for the party" in phrasing so courteously laced with irony it bordered on the theatrical, envisioning the confusion it would sow among those who viewed $2,200 as a trivial sum for a celebration that marginalized one child in favor of the other, a petty yet profoundly satisfying counterpunch that leveled the emotional playing field without requiring me to raise my voice or escalate into outright confrontation. Alex looked up from his meal at the subtle shift in my posture, his curiosity piqued by the faint smile tugging at my lips as the transaction confirmed with a soft chime. And when he inquired with that gentle probing only he could manage what exactly I'd just done to warrant such an expression, I shared the details in a conspiratorial whisper that drew a genuine chuckle from him for the first time in ages, the sound reminiscent of simpler days when we'd team up against household chores with inside jokes about comic book villains plotting their comeuppance, and he raised his glass of iced tea in a mock toast to the audacity of it all, admitting that it felt good to see me push back against the one-sided dynamics that had worn us both down like sandpaper on raw wood. Mark's retort arrived almost instantaneously in a flurry of follow-up texts that bombarded my notifications with accusations of pettiness and sabotage, decrying how my stunt would only hurt Ben, who deserved an untainted send-off into adulthood. But I silenced the alerts with a swipe and steered the conversation toward Alex's evolving sketch series inspired by those dystopian tales we devoured during pandemic lockdowns, discussing color palettes and narrative arcs that filled the evening with a tentative lightness absent for too long, though beneath the surface my mind was already charting the subsequent fortifications needed to safeguard our sanctuary from further intrusions. The glow of that small victory carried me through the bedtime routine of loading the dishwasher and folding laundry in the dim basement light. But as I turned my attention to the nagging issue of the front door lock that had been jamming intermittently since the last harsh winter storm, I retrieved the toolbox from its spot in the garage amid the scent of motor oil and forgotten holiday decorations, methodically unscrewing the outdated deadbolt with a screwdriver whose grip felt empowering in my hand, like an extension of my resolve to bar the emotional opportunists who'd plundered our stability for years, each turn evoking flashbacks to pivotal slights, such as the Father's Day 5 years back when Mark ditched our planned cookout for a golf escapade with colleagues, forcing me to man the grill alone while Lisa gushed over Ben's youth league accolades as if they eclipsed everything else, or that chaotic Christmas morning when Alex's eagerly anticipated bicycle ended up repurposed as Ben's hand-me-down due to Mark's flimsy explanation of a store clerical error. Memories that propelled my efforts onward until I'd replaced not just the entryway mechanism, but every access point in the house, the back slider overlooking the modest yard, the side garage entrance cluttered with Alex's bike, and even the humble shed housing garden tools, with gleaming new hardware purchased during a hurried lunch break from the neighborhood depot on 3rd Street, the metallic clicks of installation resonating like declarations of independence that transformed our home from a permeable target into an impenetrable haven. By the time I distributed the fresh keys to Alex and watched him test the back door before ascending to his room with a nod of approval that conveyed more gratitude than words could, the structure around us seemed sturdier in every sense, a bulwark against the relational raiders who'd long overstayed their welcome, and as I settled into bed with the familiar creak of the mattress springs, allowing the steady drone of the air conditioning unit to lull me towards sleep, my phone stirred once more. On the nightstand with an incoming call from an unrecognized local number that I permitted to divert to voicemail after 3 insistent rings, only to retrieve the recording moments later in the shadowed quiet where Lisa's voice emanated with a blend of urgency and reproach, insisting that my recent antics had crossed a line into outright hostility and alerting me that the entire extended family intended to converge on my doorstep the following day to hash out the discord before it irreparably damaged Ben's prospects and the remnants of what we once called unity. Lisa's voicemail echoed relentlessly through my thoughts as the first light of dawn filtered through the half-drawn blinds in my bedroom the following morning, her words carrying that familiar mix of sisterly worry laced with the judgmental undertone she reserved for situations where Ben's spotlight risked dimming even slightly, as if his trajectory toward academic and athletic stardom somehow elevated him above the everyday frailties that plagued the rest of us mortals in our Midwestern existence, and I found myself chuckling dryly into the steam rising from my oversized coffee mug in the kitchen, the bitter brew hitting my tongue with a jolt that mirrored the absurdity of her framing my newfound boundaries as some catastrophic unraveling when she'd breezed past Alex's birthday invitation with the flimsiest of alibis just days earlier, a pattern of selective engagement that had me questioning the very foundations of our sibling bond forged in the shared hardships of our parents' modest upbringing in rural Ohio. Rather than dialing her back to engage in what would undoubtedly devolve into a circular argument about family obligations and my supposed overreactions, I channeled the brewing irritation into a productive morning routine that doubled as preparation for the anticipated siege. Starting with a quick inventory of household supplies before heading out on errands that served dual purposes of restocking our larder and executing a more calculated form of pushback against the graduation gala that loomed like an unwanted specter over our lives. Driving my sensible sedan down the tree-lined streets toward the bustling party supply warehouse on the edge of town where I'd casually gleaned from Mark's earlier texts that he was coordinating the bulk of the decorations to ensure Ben's event matched the grandeur of his inflated self-image. Blending into the aisles stocked with vibrant streamers and oversized balloons under the harsh warehouse fluorescence, I approached the counter with the feigned enthusiasm of a doting relative eager to contribute anonymously, inquiring about the standing order under Mark's name for the elaborate balloon arches and personalized banners that promised to transform the community center into a shrine of adolescent triumph. And upon confirmation from the harried clerk whose name tag read Tina, I wove a tale of coordinating a surprise parallel celebration for twins in the family, drawing on just enough vague details from Ben's actual plans to sound authentic, convincing her to reserve every complimentary item in the inventory for that same weekend slot, effectively stranding Mark's vision in logistical limbo without a trace leading back to me. A revenge maneuver so ingeniously disguised as generosity that it left me suppressing a grin as I loaded my cart with neutral groceries like canned soups and fresh produce for Alex and me, the satisfaction blooming warm in my chest like the first sip of hot cocoa on a crisp fall day. Returning home through the midday traffic that clogged the main drag near the old steel mill remnants, I tested the newly installed locks one by one with a deliberate thoroughness that reinforced the sense of fortification encasing our space. The solid thunk of each bolt engaging an auditory reminder of the autonomy I'd reclaimed after years of permeable doors, both literal and figurative, that allowed relatives to traipse in uninvited bearing criticisms or demands. But the true trial of my resolve materialized that afternoon as the unmistakable rumble of tires on the gravel driveway announced an arrival, and peeking through the reinforced peephole revealed Mark's battered pickup truck with Lisa visible in the passenger seat, her posture rigid and arms folded in a stance that screamed confrontation before a word was spoken, my heart rate accelerating with a cocktail of apprehension and exhilaration at the prospect of holding the line against their intrusion. They persisted. Outside for what stretched into an interminable stretch of time, their knocks evolving from polite taps to insistent thuds that vibrated through the doorframe, interspersed with Mark's booming declarations of wanting to discuss matters rationally and Lisa's pleas laced with references to how my financial slight had crushed Ben's spirits right before his big moment. Phrases that pierced despite their manipulation because in the recesses of my mind, doubts flickered about whether my escalating defiance might inadvertently wound Alex further by positioning him as collateral in this familial feud, compelling me to remain statue still in the entryway while distracting myself by thumbing through archived family photographs on my phone. Lingering on a faded image from Ben's 5th birthday picnic where Alex grinned ear to ear while gently pushing his brother on a backyard swing set, a relic of harmony that underscored how far we drifted into this polarized territory under Mark's divisive influence. As the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the lawn, their vehicle finally retreated with a frustrated spin of wheels that kicked up dust in its wake, granting me a fleeting triumph in the form of my supply sabotage that I could almost visualize unfolding in Mark's frantic calls to vendors come delivery day. Yet that momentary peace shattered when a new notification chimed from an unexpected source. A message from the high school guidance counselor referencing a discreet follow-up regarding Ben's college application dossier that included some irregularities warranting parental clarification. A subtle twist that snagged in my thoughts because I'd personally reviewed and endorsed those submission materials based on the glowing endorsements Mark had provided without a hint of scrutiny, planting the seed of suspicion that the pedestal upon which Ben perched might harbor fractures concealed by layers of familial pride and perhaps something more deliberate. With evening settling in and the house enveloping us in its secured quietude, I relished the clever architecture of my interference, imagining the chaos it would unleash on their preparations. A witty undercutting that evened the scales without direct confrontation, but the counselor's alert lingered like an unresolved chord in a song, teasing at underlying deceptions in Ben's narrative that no one had deigned to share with me fully. And just as I mustered the resolve to reply seeking more specifics, the serene dusk outside fractured with the pulsing glow of emergency lights piercing the windows, a patrol car pulling to a halt directly in front of our driveway as two uniformed figures emerged with purposeful strides and flashlights sweeping the porch, their authoritative raps on the door echoing through the hall with my name uttered in tones that conveyed official urgency, turning the evening's calm into a vortex of uncertainty because whatever prompted law enforcement to my threshold on this ordinary Tuesday could only stem from the ripples of my recent assertions spiraling into territories I hadn't fully anticipated or controlled. Those flashing lights from the patrol car bathed the front of the house in intermittent strobes of blue and red that danced across the living room curtains like some macabre disco, signaling the intrusion of official scrutiny into my carefully constructed bubble of retaliation. And as I approached the door with my pulse thundering in my ears louder than the fading echoes of Mark and Lisa's earlier departure, I caught a glimpse through the peephole of two officers stepping forward under the motion sensor porch light, one a stocky man with a mustache that evoked every grizzled small-town lawman from those late-night crime dramas we used to watch as a family before everything fractured, and the other a sharp-eyed woman whose uniform carried the polished efficiency of someone who'd seen her share of domestic tangles without flinching, their presence alone amplifying the knot of anxiety twisting in my gut because in all my years navigating post-divorce skirmishes, nothing had ever escalated to badges on my doorstep over a simple lock change and a sarcastic dollar transfer. Cracking the door open just wide enough to establish a barrier while keeping the security chain engaged as a final line of defense, I met their steady gazes and inquired in a voice steadier than I felt what prompted this unannounced visit to our quiet neighborhood where the biggest disturbances usually involved unruly teenagers revving engines past curfew and the female officer, whose name tag identified her as Ramirez, explained with professional detachment that they'd received a welfare check request from a concerned family member alleging erratic behavior on my part, including barring access to the children and engaging in unusual financial transactions that could signal deeper distress or even risk to those involved. A narrative so blatantly skewed from Mark's playbook of painting me as the unstable ex that I nearly laughed out loud at the sheer audacity of him weaponizing the system against my bid for autonomy. ushering them inside after unfastening the chain with a calculated show of cooperation to avoid any escalation that might draw the neighbors' prying eyes from behind their Venetian blinds. I gestured toward the kitchen table, still bearing the remnants of our afternoon snack in the form of scattered cracker crumbs and empty soda cans, brewing a pot of fresh coffee whose rich aroma filled the space as a gesture of hospitality that doubled as a stalling tactic while I gathered my thoughts on how to dismantle their preconceptions without coming across as defensive or deranged, and as they settled into the mismatched chairs with notebooks at the ready, Ramirez elaborated that the call originated specifically from Mark, who described my actions since the divorce as increasingly volatile, culminating in the door-locking incident and the peculiar $1 payment that he framed as potential evidence of mental or monetary unraveling, details that prompted me to recount the sequence of events starting from Alex's solitary birthday amid the family's conspicuous absences and building to the graduation funding demand that ignored our son's recent hurt, weaving in just enough context about the lopsided favoritism toward Ben to humanize my responses without veering into outright accusation, all while the mustachioed officer, Sergeant Hale, his badge proclaimed, nodded occasionally and scribbled notes that made me wonder if this was mere procedure or the prelude to advising me on restraining orders or counseling referrals. They didn't belabor the points, wrapping up their questions with assurances that such family disputes often resolved with open communication and suggesting I reach out to social services if tensions persisted. But as Ramirez rose to leave and her eyes flicked toward the counselor's text still visible on my phone propped against the fruit bowl on the counter, she offered a quiet aside away from Hale's earshot about following through on school-related matters because they sometimes intersected with broader household stresses in ways that caught everyone off guard, a subtle hint that lingered in my mind like an unsolved riddle as I saw them out and watched the cruiser pull away into the gathering twilight, the taillights fading like the last embers of a controlled burn I'd unwittingly ignited. Seizing the momentum from that narrow escape, I dove headfirst into crafting my subsequent act of retribution that evening under the guise of digital vigilance, creating a disposable profile on the local community Facebook group frequented by our circle of acquaintances from church potlucks and PTA meetings, posting an innocuous warning about shady event vendors who'd allegedly taken deposits for parties only to deliver subpar or non-existent services, complete with fabricated anecdotes drawn from online reviews I'd cherry-picked to mirror Mark's planned expenditures, the anonymous alert designed to circulate just widely enough to sow doubt and prompt refund demands without any fingerprints leading back to my keyboard. A public exposure of minor deceit that felt like poetic justice for his welfare check ploy and left me humming a tuneless melody of vindication as I hit publish and monitored the initial likes and shares trickling in from familiar profile pictures. The ploy's clever layering provided a rush akin to outmaneuvering a difficult patient at work with unexpected empathy rather than force, satisfying in its indirect precision until the next afternoon when Lisa materialized on the doorstep uninvited once more. Her knock softer this time, but insistent enough to draw Alex from his room where he'd been refining a digital illustration on his laptop, and through the peephole I saw her face streaked with what looked like recent tears, her voice cracking as she begged entry to discuss why I was hell-bent on torpedoing Ben's future when he bore the weight of everyone's expectations on his young shoulders. Words that pierced through my resolve and forced me to confront the possibility that my escalating jabs might be eroding the fragile trust Alex held for the family unit, especially when he emerged to peer at her from the hallway and later confided over a shared bowl of popcorn that he hated being the invisible fault line in our conflicts, urging me to consider if the cost of my stands outweighed the potential for reconciliation. Yet before I could formulate a reassuring reply that bridged my anger with his caution, my phone buzzed with an incoming message from a number I didn't recognize but soon identified as Ben's spare line. The content raw and laced with accusation as he confronted me about the application discrepancies the counselor had flagged and insisted that the entire charade was a shield against a buried truth Mark had shielded me from for years to preserve some illusion of normalcy. A bombshell revelation that hung in the air like smoke from a smoldering fuse, compelling me to stare at the screen in the waning light of the living room lamp, and grapple with the dawning horror that whatever secret festered at the heart of Ben's favoritism could redefine not just his path, but the very bonds I'd fought to protect for Alex, leaving the impending confrontation with my younger son teetering on the edge of exposure that promised to either heal or obliterate what remained of our tangled legacy. Ben's accusatory text lingered on my phone screen like a shadow that refused to dissipate even as the evening deepened around our home, its words probing at the edges of secrets I'd long suspected but never confronted head-on in the midst of our family's skewed priorities that always seemed to orbit around his achievements, while Alex navigated the periphery with quiet resilience. And though part of me wanted to fire back with demands for immediate clarification on this veiled truth Mark had supposedly concealed to spare me some fabricated version of peace, I instead set the device face down on the counter and turned my attention to ordering a large pepperoni pizza from the familiar corner spot on Main Street where the crust came extra crispy and the cheese stretched in satisfying strings that promised a temporary distraction from the undercurrents threatening to pull us under, suggesting to Alex that we make an impromptu movie night of it with one of those classic sci-fi flicks he loved dissecting for their plot twists and visual effects, a proposal he accepted with a nod that carried the weight of his earlier concerns about not wanting to exacerbate the rifts I'd been widening through my series of calculated retorts. As we devoured the meal cross-legged on the living room floor amid scattered napkins and the remote's glow illuminating our faces, we bantered lightly about the film's improbable heroes and the absurdities of alien invasions in suburban settings, much like our own quiet Dayton enclave, laughter bubbling up in fits that eased the tension knotted in my shoulders from the day's intrusions. Yet beneath the surface my mind raced through fragmented recollections of Ben's odd behaviors over the past year, those unexplained absences chalked up to study sessions that stretched into evenings without tangible results, or the furtive phone conversations with Mark that hushed abruptly whenever Alex or I entered the room, prompting me to gently steer the conversation toward whether he'd picked up on anything unusual with his brother lately. A query that elicited a hesitant pause from Alex as he wiped sauce from his chin and admitted to overhearing snippets about a health scare from Ben's sophomore year that had been downplayed as a routine checkup, but seemed to linger in Mark's protective fervor. A revelation that slotted into the puzzle with chilling precision and reframed the favoritism not merely as parental bias, but as a shield constructed around vulnerabilities Ben had hidden to maintain his image of invincibility, suddenly casting my previous acts of defiance like the $1 transfer and the vendor sabotage in a light that blurred the lines between righteous pushback and unwitting cruelty toward a sibling possibly grappling with fears he couldn't voice. The insight refused to settle quietly as the credits rolled and we cleared the remnants of our feast, evolving into a resolve that simmered through the quiet hours until midnight when my phone shattered the hush with an incoming call from Mark, his voice thick with the slur of what I imagined was a tumbler of cheap bourbon from his dimly lit apartment, unleashing a torrent of fury over the Facebook post that had ignited a wave of cancellations and refund disputes for his party vendors, accusing me of systematically dismantling Ben's milestone out of spite born from the divorce's lingering bitterness, and vowing to involve authorities again if I didn't back down immediately, but rather than shrinking into apologies or explanations that would only feed his narrative, I delivered a measured counter that exposed the hollowness of his welfare check ploy and hinted at the unraveling threads in Ben's application that the counselor had illuminated, concluding the exchange with a firm disconnection that left him mid-rant echoing into the voicemail like the fading growl of a defeated engine, a final verbal parry that fortified my position even as it underscored the precarious balance we'd reached where every revelation threatened to topple the fragile equilibrium. Dawn crept in with a deceptive gentleness the next morning, the sun filtering through the kitchen window as I nursed a second cup of coffee and pondered the implications of Ben's message, only for the soft rap at the front door to interrupt my reverie, revealing not the bluster of confrontation but Ben himself standing on the porch with pallor etching his features under the early light and eyes that darted nervously as if expecting pursuit, and when I stepped aside to allow entry without a word, He crossed the threshold into the familiar space and launched into an unfiltered confession that the so-called medical issue was a grossly exaggerated heart murmur diagnosed during a routine physical 2 years prior, which Mark had amplified into a dire condition to garner sympathy from relatives and secure additional scholarship considerations through sob stories woven into every application, all while deliberately sidelining Alex to concentrate resources and attention on crafting Ben's facade of perfection that masked his own insecurities about measuring up without the crutches of favoritism. Admitting tearfully that he'd acquiesced to the deception out of a misguided loyalty to our father and a fear of disappointing the pedestal everyone had built. A torrent of truth that dismantled the illusions I'd clung to and infused my revenges with a bittersweet validation even as it hollowed out the satisfaction, forcing me to grapple with the complicity we'd all shared in perpetuating the divide that now left Alex peeking cautiously from his bedroom doorway with an expression blending confusion and reluctant empathy. In the midst of this raw exchange unfolding over mugs of hastily poured tea at the table where so many family meals had masked deeper fissures, the wail of sirens pierced the morning calm once more, drawing us all to the window where another cruiser idled at the curb, and Ramirez dismounted with a companion officer bearing paperwork that gleamed white in the sunlight, their knocks purposeful as they announced a follow-up investigation spurred by Mark's overnight report of embezzlement from the graduation fund, which he now pinned on me in a desperate bid to discredit my growing awareness of his manipulations. But upon entering and methodically reviewing the sparse financial records I provided, including the infamous $1 receipt as ironic testament to my minimal involvement, Ramirez's lips curved in a knowing smirk that betrayed her skepticism of his claims. And after a brief consultation via radio that confirmed the discrepancies in Ben's documentation traced back to forged endorsements under Mark's signature, she placed him under arrest right there in the driveway as neighbors began to gather like spectators at an unfolding drama, the handcuffs clicking shut on his wrists amid his sputtering protests that echoed hollowly into the street while Ben averted his gaze in a mix of relief and shame beside me. As the patrol car departed with Mark in tow and the dust settled over our lawn in the ensuing quiet, Ben lingered on the couch nursing his unresolved guilt while Alex joined us tentatively in the living room. The three of us navigating an awkward silence broken only by the tick of the mantel clock that marked the passage of this pivotal morning. And in that suspended moment, I couldn't help but ponder whether extending the keys to these newly fortified doors would foster the mending of bonds fractured by years of selective truths or merely reopen pathways for fresh cycles of exploitation and hurt. The ambiguity of our path forward hanging heavy like the humid air before a summer storm, because while my clever sequence of revenges had exposed the rot at our core and delivered a measure of justice that even some long overdue scores, it also illuminated the profound costs etched into the faces of my sons and the remnants of what we'd once idealized as unbreakable family ties, leaving me, and perhaps anyone witnessing this unraveling, to question if a mother's pursuit of equilibrium ever truly restores harmony or simply carves indelible scars into the narrative we inherit and reshape.